Hi class. In this video, you're going to learn how to direct quote. Now this scenario usually pops up when your professor or the assignment asks you to extract information from a source material and then put it into your own essay to prove your thesis, right? So in this video, you're going to learn how to write a direct quote, what's the difference between a direct and indirect quote, and then of course, how to use this practice in our own writing to become more effective writers. So as always, we have Louis taking a nap back there, and he'll be helping me with the lecture for today. Okay, so let's talk about direct quotes, right? So what's the difference between a direct and indirect quote? Well, on the left there, you'll see the direct quote and its exact words and phrases from a source, as opposed to the right where it says it's just paraphrased words or phrases from a source, right? And on the bottom row there, you'll see exactly what I mean by a direct quote. So on the left-hand side of the screen, it says John Schwartz notes that, quote, only 1 in 10 Americans said global warming was not happening, and just 6% were extremely or very sure that it was happening, end quote. So you can see in this bottom left quote that we have not only statistics, but we also have the kind of wording that was used in the survey to figure out how many Americans believe global warming is happening. Now, if we look at the example on the right-hand side, it just states, John Schwartz notes that only a slight minority of Americans do not believe global warming is happening. Now, we can look at it just visually. The example on the left is a lot longer than the one on the right, right? The one on the left has much more information, much more detail, as opposed to the one on the right. So this is what a good visual way of seeing what's the difference between a direct quote and an indirect quote. And at the bottom of the screen there, you'll see our source. It comes from the New York Times. This is a recent article called Americans See Climate as a Concern Even Amid Corona Crisis. All right, so why should we use direct quotes? Well, particularly you should use them because you want to make sure that the evidence that supports your argument is given to the audience, right? You want to show where your support is coming from. You want to show that you've done your research, because this also builds your credibility as a researcher or a writer, right? It shows that you've looked at recent and credible sources to give support to your idea. It also shows that you just didn't simply reword evidence and make it sound like it would support your idea, or reword someone's quote or a statistic or a study to make your main point or main argument sound right. Finally, you want to use direct quotes because you don't want to speak for a community or a source. Particularly if you're not from X community, you don't want to speak for that community, right? Or you don't want to speak for a certain individual because that's not who you are. You're not the person making the point. You're just really relaying that information into your essay to prove your argument or note some kind of opposition, right? Okay. Now, which one sounds more trustworthy to you, right? You have the direct quote on the left and you have the indirect quote on the right. Hopefully you chose the one on the left, right? The direct quote, because that's really the one that sounds more trustworthy, particularly because you can see we have statistics. It says only 1 in 10 Americans, and then later on it says 6%, right? We also have where it says the wording from the interviews that were given. So extremely or very sure that it was not happening, right? So we have a lot more detail on the left-hand side. We have a lot more, you could say, muscle to this quote rather than the one on the left, or I'm sorry, the right, that doesn't have much at all. It just says that only a slight minority of Americans do not believe global warming is happening. So we don't know how many, what are their feelings to it? Are they extremely or very sure it's not happening? We don't have those kinds of details, right? So you can see how that the one on the right here really loses a lot of power, and it doesn't seem as trustworthy because we don't have exact numbers, exact figures, exact details as how people believe about this. So you want to make sure that you sound trustworthy and powerful with your quotes when you bring them up. So direct quotes help you do that. All right, now let's talk about the parts of a direct quote, right? So in the highlighted green, we'll see that's what's called the attributive tag. We know this tells us who is saying this, right? It's important to note who's saying this because then we can look it up. If there's someone famous or if there's some kind of expert in the field, then we can acknowledge that, yes, this is most likely something that we can find valid and ethical and true, right? And then, of course, the pink is where the direct quote comes from. Let's talk about why tagging is important. So as you noted in the highlighted green before, that's what's called the tag. On the right-hand side here, you'll see the actual text itself from the New York Times. So why is tagging important? Well, you got to introduce the quote before you just throw it in there, right? You don't want to simply have a topic sentence and then you just throw a quote in there. You want to introduce the quote and the speaker to the reader. Pretend in some sense that you're at a party or you're at an interview. You want to introduce the writer to your source. So in this case, it's John Schwartz. So we'd want to introduce the reader to John Schwartz, right? It also adds context to your quote and some strength, because then you know who said it, right? If they're an expert, fantastic. That's exactly who you want to say. Or their profession. You might say John Schwartz is a writer from the New York Times. Or you want to know what community he's from. John Schwartz is from New York City. Okay. Or what kind of organization or funding. John Schwartz represents the Sierra Club. All right. This is important because this gives us context. We know who's saying what. We're also knowing if that person is reliable, if they're trustworthy, and then we can carry on from there to see if our own argument, right, as an audience, if it really carries any weight. The evolution of a tag. Okay, so you can start with saying a reporter notes that, quote, blank, 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 right? Not very detailed. It could be any reporter. It could be a professional reporter. It could be someone that's a semi-professional. It could just be a person on the street calling themselves a reporter. Doesn't sound very credible. A reporter from the New York Times notes that. Okay, now we know where they're from, but again, we still don't know who they are. Is it someone that's been there a long time? Is it someone that just started there? Again, we need more information. We could also say John Schwartz notes that. Okay, now we have a name, but we don't know who they are, right? So all three of these top tags aren't very effective because we don't have the full picture or context. Now at the very bottom, we've corrected that. We've noted John Schwartz of the New York Times notes that. So now we know who is speaking, what is their affiliation and organization, and then of course, what are they going to say, right? The quote would follow that tag. So it's important to do tagging because it helps the reader understand who's speaking, what's the organization, how credible are they, and then of course, what is the quote you're going to give from them, right? All right, now let's figure this out in a simpler way, right? So a meme that you might know. So on the top there, a direct quote without a tag, we don't want that. Now a tagged quote that explains the source's credibility, that's exactly what we want. Think about that next time you write, right? So if you didn't get anything out of this, hopefully this meme explains it to you. All right, so the final result. In these different colors, if you've watched the body paragraph video, if you haven't, I'll put that link in the description. This goes with the Preek method, right? So we have a topic sentence, the reason, the example, the explanation, and then of course at the very bottom there, the closing. So let's use this sample body paragraph to show you what I mean by tagging and how to use direct quote. So here's our topic sentence in the yellow. Despite the coronavirus, I believe that climate change is still a major worry for Americans. The reason is in green. My personal view of this issue is backed by recent surveys conducted by Yale University. So even here, we're introducing the reader to where our source is coming from, right? So Yale University. Then we have the direct quote. So here's our first E. For example, John Schwartz of the New York Times notes that, quote, only 1 in 10 Americans said global warming was not happening, and just 6% were extremely or very sure that it was not happening, end quote. Okay, so now we've done our direct quote. Now we got to explain it. Schwartz highlights this data point from Yale to prove that climate change is still an important issue for Americans in the COVID-19 era. Okay, now we've given it context. It's helping go back to the topic sentence there in the yellow. The blue and the yellow help each other out, right? It supports each other. Now, our closing statement, right? Therefore, we must continue to advocate for stronger climate action from our government to safeguard the future. So we're asking the audience to take some kind of action in this body paragraph. This is one quick way to look at how your body paragraph should look, but of course, how a direct quote fits into that, right? Now, again, if we would have just wrote, for example, John Schwartz says that only a few Americans think global warming is not happening, and then we continued on, it wouldn't be as a powerful paragraph, right? We want to make sure we give those details and those facts, statistics, and the very words that John Schwartz noted from the Yale interview, because that helps build our case, that helps support our thesis, right? So you can see what the final result is there. Okay, so I hope that helped you understand what direct quotes are, why they're effective, how they're different than indirect quotes, and of course, how you can start bringing them into your own writing, right? A good way to do this with an outline is to find quotes that you like from an essay or an article and copy paste them into a separate Word document, or write them down or highlight them, right? That way, once you have those and you're writing your essay, you can say, okay, Here's the quote I'm going to use. I'm going to put it into that body paragraph, and you can explain it and move on, right? That's a good way to start from this point forward. All right. So I hope that clarifies what a direct quote is, and I hope you start using them more often in your essays to make yourself a more effective reader. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks so much.